Well, good day to everyone joining us and welcome to today's X Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Digital Health Tools That Will Transform Cancer Treatment. My name is Soumya Shashikumar and I'll be your X Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes. This webinar is designed to be interactive and webinars work best when you are involved, so please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box, and the speakers will try to attend to your questions during the Q&As during the presentation. This chat box is located in the control panel and that's on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. I would also like to welcome our attendees viewing this presentation from our LinkedIn Live event, and I encourage you to submit questions as well via the comments tab. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available for streaming to those who registered on xtalks.com. At this point, I would like to thank Bioformus who developed the content for this presentation. Bioformus enhances the drug development life cycle with purpose-built remote digital solutions that capture biometric and participant-reported data and transform it into actionable insights. The Bioformus platform leverages novel digital biomarkers, data science, and purpose-built tools to support researchers in advancing the most effective personalized therapies from discovery through commercialization. Now I would like to introduce our speakers for today's event. Jaydev Thakur leads Bioformus Connect Life Sciences Business Unit as the GM, and as the COO, he leads global operations across various business functions, including customer success, sales and marketing operations, regulatory and quality, manufacturing, supply chain, and more. Jaydev has over 30 years of experience in leadership roles at organizations that include Fortune 100 companies, and rapidly growing startups. Prior to Bioformus, Jaydev led digital health innovation and IT operations for global clinical trials at the world's leading biotech Amgen for 14 years, driving product value and patient outcomes. And Daniel Hach, as the global digital health of TA Oncology at Boehringer Ingelheim and the former COO of BIX, the company's digital lab, Daniel Ha has a deep understanding of digital strategy and transformation, particularly in oncology. He's well versed in areas such as digital health, digital platforms, and digital economy. Daniel's expertise also extends to user-centered design, data science, Scrum, and Agile. And now, without further ado, I would like to hand the mic over to our speaker, Jaydev. You may begin when ready.
Thank you, Soumya, for the introductions and the warm welcome. And I'm honored to be joined by Daniel. I'll briefly walk through it just for a few minutes, the problem that both Daniel and I and many others in the industry that we see working together to solve. A little bit I'll spend time providing an understanding of Bioformus, and I'll only take a few minutes to highlight the areas where Bioformus is working on. And then we'll really be having a conversation between me and Daniel on a few different topics. Again, I would encourage the audience to continue to send us the questions and we'll pick those up along the way. Again, I'll note this isn't meant to be a scripted presentation anyway. So you're going to see Daniel and me go back and forth, and particularly your questions will continue to keep us on completely off the script as well. With that, let me move to some of the problem areas that we see as the technology continues to move the needle, and we certainly see care shifting more and more towards patients' home. It still remains a challenge when it comes to oncology, the cancer care and research. One data point that we were quite astonished to see that only about 6.3% of Americans that are diagnosed with cancer are offered clinical trials. On the other end, most clinical trials, as we know, tend to be fairly late in recruitment. And the same goes with access to treatment, particularly in the rural areas when there is a requirement that the patients are traveling, in many cases, quite a bit of miles and distance to get to the oncology clinic center where they can get the treatment. So there's certainly room for significant improvement there, as well as you can see in the data point, 2 to 16% from racial and ethnic minority group are given access to clinical research. So there's a lot to be done there. The other area that we also find is in oncology. Many of the drugs that have had significant positive value in managing the cancer itself, it also unfortunately comes with a bit of side effects. And these side effects often tend to be causing enough disruption in patient's life that very frequently that causes the adherence and patient drop off. So what can we do to help patients better manage the treatment side effect, particularly as the digital technologies continue to advance? And then the last bit we'll a little bit talk about is how a companion solution potentially can help in a journey where patients are dealing with the cancer, and along with that, they're expected to remember sometimes fairly complex set of instructions. One of the studies that was conducted had highlighted that almost 40 to 60% patients don't remember in about 10 to 80 minutes after the instructions were given what instructions physicians gave them. So there's certainly room for can digital companion tools help patient in that journey better manage the symptoms. Let me talk a little bit about Biopharmis. Biopharmis has two business verticals. We are privileged to be working in both of the sectors, one focused on healthcare, another one working on partnerships with life science companies in clinical trials and advancing novel therapeutics. On the healthcare side of our product offering, we focused on managing patients in acute setting to the post-acute setting, post-hospital discharge, and in some cases, chronic conditions as well. When we work with life science companies, we are frequently working on very early stage clinical trials and clinical development, advancing clinical trial with remote monitoring, remote data collection, and then frequently that journey continues in developing companion solutions that enable either a dose escalation or clinical decision support or better identification of patient as things move into a commercial setting. And developing those digital measurements and biomarker, frequently it starts early on in a phase 1 or phase 2, then it becomes a journey that you can take all the way till developing companion solutions. So in early stage, our work involves personalizing the medication or often developing software as a medical device, SAMD, that become companion tool. In the late stage clinical trials, frequently the decentralization, leveraging solutions that can enable patient to participate in trials remotely has been our focus. And in companion solutions, as I talked about, it's really around providing real-world data collection and potentially decision support tool for the physicians. This does require, beyond technology, number of areas. So we are very well versed with providing different sensors for appropriate disease area, patient support and engagement, as well as necessary advanced analytics capability, frequently develop in partnership with our life science partners. And the platform at a very high level includes a set of technologies that allow remote data collection through sensors and wearable, through active symptom surveys and EPROs, and then feed all this data into an advanced analytics engine that ultimately provides insights in a clinical command center leveraged by either the clinical researchers or the clinical care team. Here is a very brief snapshot of some of our projects that we've currently been working on that has given us enough insight that you will see we end up discussing from our experience perspective that from working with large academic institutes to a number of pharma companies. And one example has been specifically around CAR-T, where we, in partnership with Vanderbilt, worked on designing a solution and test it out that does the technology really work in keeping patients safe and being monitored remotely post-infusion. With that, let me bring it back to the topics of pain points that we wanted to discuss in this conversation. And with that, open up to a little bit Daniel. Daniel, share some thoughts that I know you're passionate about driving innovation and how do we drive meaningful outcome differences in something that really affects the patient. And both yourself, your team, and BI has been quite thought leaders in this space. Any thoughts you can share that when it comes to expanding access to treatment or clinical research, what work you see happening in the industry or what your passion areas or what BI has been working on?
Yeah, happy to. And thanks for having me, Jada. So we first of all have to realize that we're asking a lot from patients in clinical trials. We need to do a lot of labs, a lot of imaging, and we need them to be in the hospitals quite frequently. So wherever we can take some burden away from them to remote monitor them during a clinical trial, I think that can be helpful. And obviously we need to think about also maybe different groups of patients who might have different preferences in that, but there is clearly patients who would prefer to be able to spend more time at home and be remote monitored instead of having to go to the hospital, which is often then the academic center, right? Quite frequently.
Yeah, no, Daniel, that's an excellent point. I think what you're highlighting, and I'll a little bit underline that as we pursue some of these approaches, you mentioned patient preferences, that we have to be sensitive to that it's possible, and we've certainly in our work run into some of this as well, that while the primary desire is that patient has an option to be monitored at home and spend more time at home, there are patients that don't have robust support at home, and their home is not set up for some of these things. So not forgetting that some patient actually might choose to stay in hospital. We should be thinking about patient preferences for those, and hopefully good many of them could benefit from being monitored or recover from home. We could provide a way to monitor their home and shift their home. So that certainly will open up both in trials as well as, I guess, in a commercial setting for people to be able to access therapy without sometimes traveling, to your point, to academic medical centers that might be 50 to 100 miles away. Could that treatment be shifted more towards a community clinic nearby? So let me ask you, Daniel, what's preventing today from some of this community clinic in participating? I hear this all the time, that for certain therapies, particularly like CAR-Ts and BiTE, patient has to go to limited infusion centers. What's driving that?
Yeah, so there's certainly quite difficult procedures that need to be followed in order to safely administer an innovative treatment like CAR T-cell therapy or bispecifics. And there is quite some side effects to be managed around that. There can be the occurrence of CRS, it can be ICANS, which is a sort of neurotoxicity, and others. So the centers or the treating clinic needs to be well prepared from a processes and knowledge point of view. But also there's the other factor that prevents many of them, which is around the inpatient monitoring that is often required. So especially in the community, community cancer centers are often not able to do inpatient monitoring. They are only able to administer outpatient treatment. And that kind of disables them generally to provide such treatment to their patients.
Yeah, thank you, Daniel. I think this is an important element, and we'll further discuss some of the side effects that Daniel just described. That it's not that there is some kind of a special tie-up only with academic centers. Patient safety is the primary reason why this is limited currently, that you only can get some of this treatment at limited center because they are properly set up for that. Now, if we can expand that monitoring capability into the community clinic through the advancement of digital tool, that can potentially, I guess, Daniel, substantially improve access to some of this.
Oh, so, yes, for sure.
Yeah, let's talk about, Daniel, some of these side effects. This frequently comes up in the setting that oncology, over the last, I would say, 5 to 7 years, has seen many novel therapies come to the market that are quite remarkable, have improved the outcome quite significantly, while they also carry some concerning and serious side effect. It happens on very small percentage of people, but in order to keep the patient safe and all of them safe, even though it's happening in very small percentage of the patient, all the patients are now expected to be stuck in a hospital being monitored for these side effects. Yeah. Talk about some of these side effects, and I'll actually roll through a few slides that a little bit goes into it as you talk.
Yeah, let me maybe clarify one thing first before we dive deeper into it. To a certain extent, that is even intentional. So with immuno-oncology therapies, we want to activate the immune system to fight the cancer. So some level of activation is desired, and it shows that the mechanism of action works in those treatments. What we want to avoid is an overactivation, an overreaction of the immune system. And that is what we have to detect and find early, so the relevant countermeasures can be taken. And then it is also quite well manageable. We just need to know.
That's an excellent point, Daniel. That underlying mechanism of some of this treatment is designed to get that kind of an immune response. You just don't want over response. And that's where some of the monitoring and predictive capabilities potentially can help time it, that when do you actually need to intervene versus let the system's response actually be helping the patient the way it is designed to be.
Yeah.
Maybe Daniel, talk a little bit more about the common issues that we frequently hear are around this cytokine release syndrome, CRS, and it's getting a lot of attention nowadays. That what is underlying CRS and what's happening to better detect CRS tool in the industry. We do a lot of work with you and others, so certainly happy to add there too. And then often it's also hard to differentiate between CRS or sepsis or some of the other side effects like neurotoxicity. Let me pass it on to you.
Yeah, so far we have been most active around the cytokine release syndrome, which is one of those overreactions of the immune system. And here we often see patients getting a fever and then having increased heart rate, respiration rate, and so on. So those types of body vitals need to be monitored, and that is what we are considering to do via a sensor, and then an algorithm analyzing the data coming from the sensor in order to find out if patients are at risk of developing such a cytokine release syndrome. In contrast to that, ICANS is an example of a neurotoxicity. It stands for immune effector cell associated neurotoxicity syndrome. And that is something that needs to be monitored differently. It's typically done through the so-called ICE score. And here we are earlier in our thinking in terms of how could that be better monitored through digital technology.
Indeed. And in this question frequently comes up, right, that how feasible is it even to monitor? So I'll just very quickly, we will not get into the data science part of it, but some of the work that is currently happening that's showing quite promise. So here is one snapshot of, I shared previously the work we did with Vanderbilt, and in the high level model of how could this operationally be successful, that as soon as the patient is registered, pre-infusion, we would give them a wearable sensor, typically a patch form factor, and we can get into, if time permits, what are the different form factors and how can you manage patient burden by choosing the right sensor. But give them a patch or a appropriate sensor that starts to collect data even pre-infusion, provides that baseline, and then as the data comes in from these sensors, you feed that data into the engine where algorithm can appropriately generate the alert. And in those alerts then appropriately go to the intervention team that take an action. From a data science perspective, again, there are some very promising results. I would still call this an early work, with the data sets that are available, that from the point of infusion in a 2 hour, 4 hour, 6, 8 hour window, you can see, or days after the therapy, from the ground truth, how the predictive capabilities are fairly matching. So there is a high predictability in many of these cases. And as Daniel mentioned, there are a number of parameters from vital sign perspective that you need to capture. This is where we need to think about, are every one of these parameters truly needed? How can you balance the risk of a overly burdening patient, because sometimes you may need more than one device to capture all of this parameter, versus as we advance the data science, what are the fewer parameters that are most telling signs of when you need to intervene? And then similarly, not only the CRS work, sepsis work, there's a good amount of, yeah.
Can I ask you a question on the previous page?
Please, go ahead.
Yeah, before you get to the sepsis, but on the CRS here, when you look at the chart, you can see some misses that are quite early, and then one miss on day 7, I think. And in between, it's very high accuracy. So can you explain why it was maybe more challenging in the first couple of hours?
Yeah, I think, Daniel, that's an excellent question. Part of it is that many of these algorithms are designed to be personalized and predictive based on patient's own data set. Now you could imagine, often patient might not have come in this case for the pre-infusion baseline. So first few hours of data is what's guiding. You can almost think about if someone's heart rate is spiking, well, that spike could be for a number of reasons. And a resting heart rate for Daniel, who happens to be playing a lot of sports, could be much lower than someone that is more sedentary and is actually much higher. So these parameters, if you take it in an absolute context, often are not as impactful as if you can develop patient's own baseline. And using that baseline, if you're training the algorithm, you see a far better accuracy. So that's part of the challenge, that in the first few hours or early phase of their journey, you might not have enough of the patient's baseline to be able to as precisely judge.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it's important to collect that baseline, to have a comparison, because also body temperature is a bit different from person to person, right? The standard baseline, for example.
Exactly. And this is also, Daniel, nicely calling out that while the technology is certainly improving and in getting to the point where it might be getting much more predictive, while it is still under development, we still have to be mindful that maybe if you look at this data set, as much as we would like to get the patient home at the earliest, maybe for the first 24 hours, they do need to still keep in a hospital. And only after that, it may be safe enough to send them home and rely upon a technology as an additional tool to keep the patient monitored on this. And then some of this have to be tuned also specific to the therapy or the type of the cancer. So a number of these data points we are still learning. And as we learn, we'll probably have better understanding of what's the predictive capability of the algorithm. And to your point, how soon does it start? And it may be different for different therapies. All right. And this is where, Daniel, I feel like the work that we've been doing with BI, it certainly feel like industry leading, that some of the therapies that will come out hopefully would provide that industry leading proof point that this can be monitored safely at patient's home and with the guidance of what's the right time point when patients should be going home. Because this is where it requires investment, quite a bit of data collection to train these algorithms. Often I know nowadays with the generative AI, the word AI and machine learning is thrown almost like a magic, that no matter what your problem is, you just apply generative AI and magically it solves the problem. As you and I know, it doesn't. It requires quite a bit of years of careful planning and investment. And again, kudos to companies and partners like BI, where you are making those multi-year investment to collect the data and help advance science that eventually might help not only your therapies, but transform the industry and help many others with tools that give patient an option to stay home safely.
Yeah, and that's clearly, and we'll talk about that in a bit more detail later, but we would clearly welcome others to join in, because we don't see this as something we should solve on our own, but rather we could solve as an industry together. So let's talk about that a bit more later.
Absolutely, Daniel. I'll be sure coming back to it. I think that's a fairly material point. I think we've touched upon CRS, and I think similarly, I only had the slides to highlight that the work is happening, and there's quite a bit of data science work, both biopharmacists as well as in the industry, in the pharma company and other companies that are doing very good work that gives the promise that hopefully in a few years from now, we would have fairly reliable tools that allow us to measure some of this serious side effect with reasonable accuracy that then allows patient to be sent home and safely monitored. Here is a set of neurological tests that also helps us evaluate ICANS that Dana briefly described earlier. Now, we talked about that this takes quite a bit of work, and in some of these algorithms are now treated as a medical device. The industry word has been SAMD, software as a medical device. And for the right reason, regulatory agencies around the world, including FDA, has created a pathway and closely working with the industry to guide how should you be advancing it. By no means regulatory agencies are blocking it. If anything, we find they're actually quite supportive and partnering with us as we define this. But it takes quite a bit of work. So maybe, Daniel, if I could pass it back to you, and I'll bring up a slide that it takes quite a bit of planning and work to get some of these algorithms cleared. Can you walk us through the journey that what is it taking to do and why it's so burdensome to get some of these algorithms cleared? What's the good reasoning behind it? Or is this just bureaucracy?
No, it's clearly not. And so I want to say that I'm not the expert on this. So I will turn this question back to you, JDF, in a moment. But it's clearly, in general, we want to develop solutions that help patients to be monitored remotely. That also gives us an obligation to do this properly and to not put any risk onto the patients. So clearly, we need to develop the solutions in a very thorough way. We need to validate them. And we need to have discussions in the beginning and towards the end with authorities, that we do it in a way that they can also rightfully approve those solutions. And just to be clear, it is also very important for us to do it thoroughly, because we need to, in the end, convince physicians and patients that those solutions are worth to be used and are safe to be used. So we better do our homework there and be prepared for tough discussions, rightfully, because of the patients that we want to treat and support.
Absolutely. I know, Daniel, we frequently talk about, would we want our brother, our mom, or dad to be monitored by a solution like this? And what level of rigor would we want for that, right? So as much as technology is advancing, the rigorous process that agencies like FDA want us to take, there's a good reasoning behind it. I'm fully with you. And as you can see, right, this is just a snapshot of what activities typically we have to go through over the years. Substantial data collection, good amount of discussions, pre-discussions with regulatory agency during the course of trial, collecting the data. And a portion of these trials are collecting data to train your algorithm, but then you need to go back and do a validation trials that are prospectively evaluating in the different circumstances. And this is where some of the, I would say, unanswered questions still remain, that could you take an algorithm, prove it for a single therapy, and feel like, could you now use the same algorithm for multiple therapies? Because what you're trying to detect is underlying the same. It's the CRS. If we learn from single therapy, couldn't it work for others? In principle, it should. But regulatory agencies are rightly nudging us to make sure we don't skip this step of validating it with different therapies and then keep coming back to an evidence-based science to go to the regulatory agencies with enough data set that gives them the comfort. And to your point, eventually, it's not the regulatory agency, it's the physicians and the patients that we also need to give enough comfort that we've done our work, we've done our part in ensuring where the safety and the boundary lines of the solution is, and where there is a boundary line that this is how far it can go. There are appropriate measurement care supportive tool so the patient is not exposed to the risk.
Absolutely.
Let me, on that front, Daniel, ask you a slightly different question. That we've been talking about patients and we've been talking about physicians. And I'm suspecting you'll probably end up sending this question back to me, but I want to hear your thoughts to start with. Have you been hearing anything from patients and physicians? What's their perspective on receiving this technology? Are they excited? They are concerned? They are overwhelmed? I'm curious to get your thoughts on what have you observed so far?
Well, that's interestingly, there is no, or obviously, there is no one patient or one physician. So there are different groups, I would say. And I can share a bit from a couple of conversations I had over the last weekend at the ESMO conference in Barcelona. And for example, there was one physician, if we start with the oncologist side, who was extremely enthusiastic and who wanted to participate in the development of such a solution, and who was very forward-thinking and really supportive on that, giving us a lot of additional ideas of how to do it and so on. So that was a very extremely positive discussion we had there. And then I had a few discussions with patient representatives on the other hand, and there it was a bit of a mixed picture. So some were really positive and said that patients would appreciate any additional day they could spend at home rather than at the hospital. But also others giving the perspective that for some patients who are, for example, rather early in their treatment journey, who really want to get it right and who might think that in the hospital they could be monitored and could be a little bit more safe, they would rather tend towards staying in the hospital. So there were two groups in those discussions. So what are your experiences so far?
Yeah, so I think, Daniel, we have learned, I think, something very similar. At this point, like our solutions on our care side of the business are deployed across 60 or more so different hospitals now. We've got at least on any particular day more than 1,500 patients on the platform. So from all that, we certainly continue to see variations to your point and in quite a bit of lessons. From a physician lens, our early failures, I would say, when we started out was the ambition that, well, we are providing such cool technology, physicians would simply love it. Nurses and HCPs will simply love it. And we quickly realized how busy in their life they are not ever going to launch into a cool new portal or a website or a dashboard just because it has got some really nice data set. They're fairly busy. And part of that busyness means they are wanting everything within a single tool like EHR that they are used to. Even after we had given them a single sign-on and a password that they didn't have to remember, if it was a net new web page, they were simply not going to, and it didn't fit into their workflow. I'm not criticizing them. I'm fully understanding why not. So our lesson was that it has to be whatever solutions, dashboards that we are developing to monitor this patient, it has to be embedded within that workflow, within the care pathway, and preferably within the tool that they are very familiar with, like an EHR system. And certainly, while it's perceived that isn't that a big burden, actually most of these health systems now have very sophisticated IT teams. There are standards. Our pharmacist integrated our solution in all of our 60, 80 hospitals we have deployed in. So I think it's quite doable. We need to make that investment and just do the proper integration. So the burden on physician is entirely minimized to see yet another dashboard. Today, it actually just shows up as a remote monitoring data like demographic and lab data in our EHR integrations. So that's one thing, invest in integration. And the second bit from a physician's lens was really coming down to what extent do they have ability to watch the data that some of the sensors have ability to send? And this comes down to continuous sensors. If a sensors are streaming data, it's almost impossible for anyone to actually just keep paying attention to when there is a temperature rising, when someone's heart rate is dropping. You need actionable insight to come out of it. And that was the other feedback that if this so-called alerts that are on a single parameter, someone's temperature is going up or someone's heart rate is going down, and you simply generate an alert, there's a huge amount of alert fatigue and noise created. You need a bit more intelligent, actionable insight that are combining some of this parameter. In some cases, we actually got the feedback that when your system is generating this alert, almost every single time, first thing that a nurse does is ask two questions. Are you feeling dizzy? Are you feeling all right? If these are the common questions, can't your system automate that? Send this question as soon as you detect such abnormality and let the patient respond to those questions. So when the team that needs to intervene gets involved, have all of this data together and reduce the burden on them to pick up the phone and call the patient. So some of these drive towards actionable insight is another thing we have noticed that makes a very substantial difference in uptake on their side. On the patient side, I think, Daniel, you hit it right on. We really want simplicity. They are managing a disease. On top of that, if it becomes a task to learn and maintain 3 or 4 different devices, their battery life and their tablet and monitor and whatnot, you really overwhelm them. Keep it simple, keep it as few devices as possible, is what we are finding. And then you're right, that the patient still will be different. There are patients that would love some of these, and there are patients that would simply feel more safer either they don't have support or for whatever reason, they have a preference to be in hospital. We shouldn't take away that optionality, give simply patient the option.
Agree. And can you say a bit more how far along you are in the journey of getting the solutions integrated into everyday care processes within the hospitals that you work with? So you talked about some early failures, but where are you now?
So I think we've generally advanced quite nicely that at this point, about 60 plus health systems and hospitals we have been deployed in, all of them, different layers of integration, but every one of them, now we are an integrated solution within that EHR. And that, to be candid, was actually the lower bar. The higher difficulty where we had to put a lot of resources was what we would call care pathway and care pathway integration. Now, by care pathway, what I mean is effectively, the other word I can use is the care protocol. That each health system has slightly variation in when they would like to do A, B, or C. For certain hospital, a set of certain alert needs to go to a head nurse, and after she gets to look at it, it goes to the physician. In certain other clinics, well, if you experience that kind of temperature difference, you immediately start intervening for the fever, and then you start intervention at the next level with the physician's help. And this small variation, fundamentally still the same, but still material variation, were quickly becoming difficult if a solution was hard-coded that, well, this is exactly the steps you can take. And we would go and tell the next hospital that, well, previous hospital, very well-regarded names like Mayo Clinic and Brigham Women's and others, that's how they do it. And the next hospital says, well, but we do it slightly differently. We're not going to take what other one is doing. It's not a question of right or wrong. This is the protocol at this hospital. So being able to adapt that care pathway and highly configurable approach there. So it's not hard-coded in a system, and just be open-minded that in the implementation process, you go with the listening ears, learn from them, how are they doing it? We bring our, what we would call best practices from the 8 other hospitals we have done, but the 9th and the 10th hospital still gets to decide that variation in the workflow and sometimes the intervention time point of when they want to do what they want to do. So that has been a major learning that we need to work with them and let them design on our platform their care pathway and protocol.
Yeah, I can believe that, and it's makes a lot of sense.
Indeed. So, Dale, that brings me to another set of questions that we talked about some of the challenges in implementation. If I bring it back to the life science side of the world, any challenges that you would highlight that getting these kind of solution ideas in life science companies developing a business case and sponsoring and working through that? Anything that you would highlight for your peers that what challenges typically you face and what your advice might be that how should they be championing something like this?
Yeah, so I would say that there's multiple challenges. And coming back to what you said before, we need to do our homework well in order to be able to convince regulatory authorities. Then it's sometimes difficult to get to the necessary sample size to bring together a good data set only out of the clinical trials by a single pharma company. So that is something where I believe joining together and doing it jointly across multiple clinical trials of multiple sponsors could make a lot of sense, and I would be very open to. Secondly, there are always different priorities in such a large company, and we need to make the case for such a solution and why it would make sense to invest into it. Overall, here I think there is an interesting case because we could bring those innovative treatments to many more patients if we were not only restricted to academic centers being able to administer them, but also community cancer centers. So that I think is a compelling story to develop and to bring across in order to get the support internally to make something like this happen.
Thank you, Daniel. So you're clearly highlighting that you're thinking beyond how it might help in a clinical trial setting, where definitely that itself is a help where you can collect data remotely and maybe do better
Yeah.
management of the adverse event. But now you're thinking after the drug might get approved in a commercial setting, access can be improved through community clinic access.
Indeed. Yes.
Very good, very good. And I think we see this as a repeating theme with number of pharma companies that frequently, if the business case and the investment is done with only one side of the team and the functions thinking about it, frequently it's not as end-to-end strategy that they benefit from. But if you
Mhm.
connect dots between clinical development and the commercial and bring
Yes.
together, there is a very different kind of a support all the way up to the executive team we find. And it seems like
Yeah.
you that magic uh, combination.
Yes, that's true. And we also see the additional benefit of collecting more data in our clinical trials, having more granular information around the adverse events and side effects. So that is also a benefit. But we are thinking it in a long-term perspective in terms of how could it also help our drugs, but also other drugs, innovative drugs like T-cell engagers, bispecifics, for example, once they are on the market.
Absolutely. Daniel, that brings me back to what you briefly touched upon earlier, that while the business case can be made for a long-term investment in some of these digital tools that supports the therapy's long-term success, not all of this have to be done in silos. And in the potential partnership that pharma companies can do together, taking some pre-competitive consortium approach. Would love to hear more your thoughts about that. That how are you thinking about what ways in which what can be shared? What would you still see as potentially IP that needs to be protected? And then how are you making that case internally?
So as we think about it right now, is that we don't intend such a solution to be a differentiator of our drug against other drugs. We see ourselves in a role that we want to support to enable the development of such a monitoring solution, and that we would be happy if somebody, like for example a tech company, would bring it to the market and enable clinics to administer those treatments. This would then enable the treatment through any of the innovative drugs that come with those side effects. And we think through that it will benefit many, and that's okay, right? It will especially benefit the patients. It will also benefit the clinics, and to a certain extent, it will also benefit us. And that's completely fine for us. And we would be happy to join in with others, and would be happy for others to join into this endeavor, because then also the whole development of such a solution is much more feasible. We could use multiple clinical trials in order to collect the data. We would have a bigger breadth of treatment modalities and different compounds that would also make the data kind of stronger and broader, and therefore also the algorithm better and more accurate. So I see many benefits in that, and if there's anybody listening to this conversation who might also have an interest in that, let's talk about it and let's discuss how we could do it together.
Daniel, I must say kudos to you. I come from the pharma side of the world, like prior to biopharmacy for 14 years, I was in a large pharma, and I frequently had confronted, and we still work with a very large many of large pharma companies. It's not easy to get past this notion of, well, we are making an investment. Can we use that as a competitive advantage? And how can that provide us an edge over everyone else? And it's understandable. It's a healthy competition when you put so much investment for almost more than a decade in bringing a drug to market. You want to maintain as much advantage to your benefit. Yet the higher road that it seems, Daniel, you are taking has got both an advantage for you and the larger industry. That when it comes to safety management, like detecting CRS, detecting sepsis, and some of this advancement in remote monitoring care pathway. If you build something in partnership with others, it could potentially get even more adoption and more trust from regulatory agencies, from patients, from health systems, because they will see this as a collaborative approach across the consortium versus a single pharma company that might have built it.
Yes, and let me emphasize that even more, because I think hospitals are confronted with such a broad spectrum of digital solutions, and they would not accept a solution that could be used with just the treatment of one pharma company. That's not an option for them. So if we want them to adopt such solutions at scale, they need to work across different treatments.
Absolutely. Daniel, with that kind of ambitious thoughts, as well as the motivating for others, that hopefully we'll continue to see more pharma companies take an approach like that. We know at least there are a few others that have expressed such an interest that we would love to, as a company, Powerpharma, build that kind of a consortium and continue to work together. And then I'm with you that ultimately this helps patients that we are trying to serve tremendously in both the trust and the speed and the cost likely at which we can build these tools and bring it to them. With that, I might bring it to a wrap and pass it on to Soumya.
Well, thank you so much for that, Jaydev. Thank you so much for that. I'm just going to go ahead and take everyone through the last few minutes of our webinar. Okay, so well, thank you very much for that very insightful presentation, and thank you very much, audience members, for your questions. We have, however, reached the end of our webinar. For those of you who are interested in hearing more from Bioformus, you can register for the next webinar, Improving Hospital Capacity Using Care at Home Strategies, scheduled for later today, using the link that I will shortly send in the chat box. And if we couldn't attend to your questions, the team at Bioformus may follow up with you. Or if you have further questions, you can direct them to the email address on your screen. Thank you everyone for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from Xtalks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen. Your participation is appreciated as it will help us to improve our webinars. Additionally, I have shared a link to view the recording of today's event in the chat box, which you can also share with your colleagues so they may register for the recording here as well. For those watching via LinkedIn Live events, we encourage you to visit xtalks.com to register for this event and gain access to features such as viewing the recording and more. Now, please join us in thanking our speakers for their time here today. We hope you found this webinar informative. Have a great day, everyone, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, Soumya. Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks a lot for having me. Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone.